Recording.
Yeah.
All right.
Silverware or something.
Well, friends, good morning once again. Welcome back to Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, the characters of the Bible here at Chapel by the Sea Presbyterian Church in Fort Myers Beach. I'm Dr. Jim Berger, the interim pastor, and your host for today. And today we're moving ahead in our story. We're up to Genesis 5 through 9. So today we are looking at Noah and the flood. And in particular, we want to look at Noah, the event known as the Great Flood, and the covenant that God makes with us as a result. Because out of this disaster comes a time of hope. So, when Noah and the Ark is one of the beloved stories from the Bible, and one that is very popular as children's lore, right? Well, that's wrong. This is a serious story and has serious consequences and effects. So we're going to look at it in four pieces. First, we're going to look at the story. Oh, it doesn't show up too well on the screen there, does it? Mm-hmm. First, we're going to look at the story. What took place? What's the details? Second, we're going to look at the comparative stories, because this is not the only flood story in the world. Third, we're going to look at the science and the pseudoscience that accompanies this story. And fourth, we'll look at the power of it as an attraction in our world today, because the ark still has legs, still carries on. So, the story begins after God has created everything. The wickedness of humankind is beyond anything he could have imagined. Well, I don't know. Did God create people with the ability to sin? We don't know. That's one of the ones. Remember that? I'm keeping a list of questions I'm going to ask God when I get to heaven. There's a lot in this story that I want to ask God about. So God realizes that humankind is really sick. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind. So he's going to do something about it. But in the process, we are told Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. Noah was a just man. And apparently he stands apart from the rest of society, from the rest of the world around him. So he finds favor with God. And God tells him, I want you to make an ark. You're going to make it out of cypress wood. You're going to put rooms in this ark. And you're going to cover it with pitch. Now, you're going to build it 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. What's a cubit? Elbow to fingertip. That's a cubit. Standard rule measurement in those days. Roughly 18 inches. So it's going to, the ship ends up being 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Now, just for comparison, the largest ships of the ancient world were the Roman grain ships, going between Alexandria, Egypt, over to Rome to feed the people. Those ships, by comparison, were about half that size, 180 feet by 45 by 43. So this ark is massive by ancient standards. He's told, build it and put a door in its side. Okay. Next, he says, when you build it, make 3 decks inside it. Okay, so Noah and his family, his boys, are going to do all this work. Now, do you suppose they just went down to the nearest lumber yard and started ordering pre-cut lumber? Let's think about this, because this is where we get into the question: is this allegory or is this fact? What's the first thing they have to do if they're going to build that ship?
Find wood.
They got to drop a lot of timber. A lot of timber. Okay? They've got to clean it off. They got to debark it, take all limbs off. They got to mill it. They got to get it into a usable format. All right. How long ago do we think this was? We're 2100. We're 2100 now. Well, we don't know for sure. But here's what remember what we said last week about Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal Cain? One of the guys was the guy that worked in metals, metalworking, in bronze and iron. When does the Bronze Age begin? Around 3000 BC, somewhere in there. So Iron Age doesn't begin until 1200 BC. Now, when you think about the amount of tools they're using, they have got to manufacture all the wood they're using, all the lumber they're using for this construction. So they've got to have tools to do that. Now, can you imagine using Stone Age tools to make that much timber? No. And it's just the family. It's not an army of slaves like the Egyptians had. The Egyptians were using bronze tools when they built the pyramids. So as we start dating this, we're probably talking early Bronze Age, just the technology, just to have the tools to do this. And it's a massive undertaking for somebody. Any of you ever been part of a household that built their own house, or either your parents or you guys? Remember how much work it took, how long it takes day after day? Imagine what these guys were doing. Okay. Now, God makes a covenant with Noah as they begin. And the covenant is, I'm going to destroy the earth, but I want you to go into the ark with your family and the animals, and I will save you. You build the ark, I'm going to save you. Now, you got to understand, I'm 72 and I don't do heavy work anymore. I found that out after I retired. I did a remodel on the house, and spent 9 months with my body telling me, no, you shouldn't have been doing that. You shouldn't have been working that hard. I was at the chiropractor every week trying to get put back together. Noah is 600 years old when he starts this project. So this is an old guy. And he's told, how many animals is he supposed to bring into that ark?
I thought that was strange because one passage said 2 of every kind, and then farther on it said 7 of the clean and
Yeah.
2 of the unclean.
Yeah, you put your finger on a major point. There's 2 stories here. In one, he's told get 2 of every kind of animal and bring it on board the ark. The other story says get 7 pairs of every clean animal, kosher animal, and 2 of every unclean animal. Well, kosher doesn't come along for another 1,000 or 2,000 years in Jewish history. So this is like an anachronism, reading back into the story, something that comes along much later. Regardless, he takes pairs of animals onto the ark and rescues them. And so all these animals are loaded on board the ark. Now he's also got to take on board enough feed and supplies to carry them for at least a year, God says. So these guys have been busy. Man, have they been working. 600 years old. So he takes everybody on board the ark. And God says, and he does it in 1 week. God says, in 7 days, I will bring the rain. So he goes in, they close the door of the ark, and it begins to rain. And it rains for nights. And we think of that and we go, oh, wow. Well, when I was in Alaska, I lived in a rainforest, Tongass National Forest. Where I lived, we got 106 inches of rain a year. For comparison, here you get about 35 or 40. Ketchikan got 140 inches. Little Port Walter was right on the edge of where the coastal storms hit the mountains. They got 205 inches of rain a year in Little Port Walter. And so we were in a very wet zone. The Tlinkits lived with that. That was a native tribe there. The Tlinkits, Haidas, and the Tsimshians were 3 tribes. And we were having a big festival one night, and one of the elders of the church was telling us a story that the missionary had been preaching in their church about how God had made it rain for 40 days and 40 nights. And one of the elders went up and said, but Reverend, that happens all the time. Why is that a big deal? What was the kind of rain? It was like that soaking rain that hit after, was it Nicholas, when Nicholas went through with all that, dropped all that rain and flooded New York and such. It's that kind of rain we're talking about. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Now that's the part that stops me in my tracks. that God would kill everything and everybody on the earth. What happens in the aftermath? Silence. This is another question I've got for God. It says the water covered the top of the mountains 45 feet deep. Whoa. Think about Mount Everest, 45 feet higher for the water, if we're literalists. Okay. And the waters flooded the earth for 150 days. The ark drifts. After 7 months, it runs aground on drifts and runs aground on Mount Ararat. Anybody ever been on a boat when it goes aground? What do you have to do?
Oh, you gotta lighten the load, you gotta throw stuff off, you gotta get out and push.
Well, the other thing that happens is on a big vessel, if you are stranded, you can't get off, you have to wait for the tide. What's that boat going to do?
You'll sit over, yeah.
It'll fall over, and then water comes back in. It won't sit upright. It'll just suck in the water. So first thing you got to do when you run aground is you got to get braces out and prop that boat up so it doesn't fall over on its side. I often wonder how they did that with the ark. Probably had a flat bottom. Probably that's how. So the ark drifts for 7 months, runs aground on Mount Ararat, and after 10 months, the waters recede and the mountains appear again. Where'd the water go?
Evaporated.
Evaporated. I mean, there's all these logistical questions we don't confront. So after 40 days, Noah's a very patient man. He sends out a raven to do a scan, and the raven doesn't come back. So a week later, he sends out a dove, and the dove finds no place to land, so it comes back to the ark. He waits a week, sends out another dove. This time it returns with an olive leaf in its beak. Ah, life is renewed on the earth. One more week, and he sends out the dove a third time, and it does not return. So after 1 year in the ark, they emerged to dry land. You thought COVID shutdown was bad. 1 year on the ark, and if it wasn't for the storm outside, you'd never be able to tolerate the smell inside, believe me. It's just what's the better alternative, least painful alternative. So they come out, and God places a rainbow in the sky. Now, for the people of that day, the rainbow is the war bow of the god of thunder, the god of the storms. And that's what he uses to shoot his bolts of lightning at the earth. But God turns it around and says, I have put my bow in the sky, so whenever you see it, you will know it'll be a perpetual sign. Never again shall I destroy the earth in this manner. So that becomes a sign of hope, a sign of another covenant that God makes with us, that he shall not destroy us in that way. And then whenever we see that rainbow, we claim the hope that is ours. It's always exciting, isn't it, when you see a complete rainbow, not just a piece of one, but a thing. One night, I was doing a wedding at South Seas on Captiva Island, and it rained. So we took the couple. It was just it was an elopement. It was just a husband and wife, and we went down to Ding Darling, went up into the observation tower, Ding Darling Park, and we did the wedding up there after we sprayed everybody with bug spray. And afterwards we came down and there was rainbows out, so we went to the end of Sanibel Island, the Sunset Beach, right where Sanibel ends and Captiva begins. And on that beach there, we were taking pictures. My wife was taking the photographs. That was when she was still doing wedding photography. She was taking the photographs of the couple against the sunset. And I happened to look over my shoulder, and behind us is a complete perfect rainbow. And so she runs the couple up the beach, and they're dancing under the rainbow on their wedding day. And I tell a couple, you can only have that picture if you're willing to dance in the rain on your wedding day. But the rainbow for us becomes a symbol of hope, a symbol of God's care and God's love. So Noah and the flood senses a bunch of symbolism about God and about our world. So what have we learned about God up to this point in our 3 sessions?
Sovereign.
He's sovereign. He's watching out for us. So what does this story teach us about God?
He has a temper.
He has a temper? Well, that's one way of putting it. Another is we are accountable.
Yeah.
There is accountability. There's judgment for our actions, for the actions that people take. An important one to remember. But here God makes 2 covenants in this story. In the first one, before the storm, he tells Noah that he will save his family and Noah will save the animals. In the second covenant, afterwards, God promises he will never again drown the earth. Okay, that's the basic story. What else is there? Well, we can look at the comparisons because, like I said, this is not the only flood story in the world. The flood myth originates in Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq. Now, this is going to be important because where's Abraham going to come from?
Which one?
Abraham. Where will Abraham come from? That's next week's lesson. He's going to come from Iraq. All these different stories are all going to wrap around the Mesopotamian region between the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia is Greek for between the rivers. Meso, between Potamia river. So between the rivers. That area and Israel and Egypt are going to be central to everything that goes on in the rest of the Bible. So the original stories come from that part of the country. There's 3 in particular. 2 are Sumerian. One is the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's the most well-known. And in that story, Utnapishtim, or the Noah figure, rescues Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, by building a giant reed boat and sailing it and protecting the king and taking all the animals on board. This is a bas-relief clay tablet from well, it was ancient Babylon, that region, the same area we're talking about, between the rivers. And there's astounding similarities between the stories. In both stories, God sends the flood. Both stories, the Noah figure is ordered to build an ark. They have to gather 2 of every animal. In the Gilgamesh story, the rain lasts 6 days and all the wicked are wiped out. Here, the rains last 40 days and all the sinners die. 3 different birds are sent out in both stories, and the ship comes to rest on a mountain. So which came first, Gilgamesh or Noah? They're both ancient. But when I was in Alaska, out of my front window, I could see Devil's Thumb, a spike of granite 20 miles inland. It was 5 miles over to that far shore. And by the way, at that far shore, at the shoreline, it's 600 feet deep. 100 fathoms at the shoreline. And the myth, one of the Tlingit myths is that during the Great Flood, Raven, who was their archetypal hero, their character, Raven tied his canoe to the top of Devil's Thumb. And there's a ring of quartz in the midst of that granite. And they said that's where his rope was, around the top of the mountain. Alaska? The stories
From the Middle East.
from the Middle East to there, I mean, stories of flood are commonplace. And it can be shifting land, you know, that tectonic plate shifts and all of a sudden whole areas or whole ecologies change. We don't know what exactly caused it. But here's my point. Those comparisons tell us that this is an allegory. This is not, this is not a news report. This is an allegory. It's teaching us a lesson. And the lesson it wants us to get is we are to be obedient to God. We are to trust in God. We are to keep our covenants with God. And we are to hope in God. So if you try to make it exactly, try to say everything happened exactly this way, you got a 600-year-old guy with stone tools or early bronze tools creating a vessel twice as large as the largest vessels of the day, of later, not even that day, later, sometime around thousands and thousands of years ago. We don't know when. We don't know. But that's going to get us into the next section. And that is the so-called science of this, or as I call it, the pseudoscience. By consensus, scientists believe the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. All right. But then there's another whole school of science called creation science. And they are taking everything from the Bible literally, absolutely the way it says. And by their thinking, the Earth is 6,000 years old, and the flood occurred in 2348 BC. Right, now, where do you get this information? How can you say that the Earth was created 4,000 BC when science tells us it's 4.5 billion years old? Well, you have to take everything flat out literally in the Bible. Now, this dating, that was created by Bishop James Ussher, prelate of Ireland, in 1654. Ussher wanted to figure out when all this took place, how old was the Earth? So he sat down and he took the Bible, best information he had, 1654, remember, and he took all the genealogies and he counted back and he figured a generation is probably 20 years. And so he started counting back every generation, and he got back to the idea that the Earth was created on the 22nd of October, 4004 BC, a little before nightfall. He was that specific. Now, was he crazy? Did he do something wrong? No, Ussher was working with the best information he had at the time. Think about what science was like at this time. You were closer to Aristotle than you are to where you are today, far closer. You're still using the same ideas that Aristotle used. He pegged the flood at 2348 BC. Now, any of you see the articles? I saw it on CNN, it's been in other places, that they found the oldest human footprints in North America in New Mexico recently. They figured the dating is 23,000 years old. They did that taking seeds and spores and pollen from the layers above the slab with the footprints and below it. And by bracketing it, carbon dating them, they can get a range. And most likely those footprints are 23,000 years old. And yet, we're told the Earth is only 6,000 years old. So biblical literalists and creation science want to keep everything exactly the way the Bible says, and they maintain that everything was created in 6 literal days. Furthermore, they hold that all those strata of stone and fossil evidence were all laid down in 1 year during the flood in 2348 BC. Now that's flood geology. And there's a whole lot of people who believe this. I was a biology major when I started college, and people were shocked that I was a biology major and a Christian. What's the big deal, man? All we're looking at is how God did it. If I believe God did it, but I'm looking at how, what happened. So flood geology takes this very, very literally. And although they say they're serious, the courts and the scientific community recognize creation science, flood geology, as a pseudoscience. It's not real. Why? Because you start from the wrong premise. You start from the premise that because it's in the Bible, it has to be exactly the way it's written. And if you start from that premise, you're going to get everything wrong. It rules out God's creative power and the ability of God to use science for God's own ends. And that's what God does. I mean, the reason we've got vaccines is because we had scientists who've been working on this for 20 years. And when the notice came what the codes were for the genetics of this COVID virus, they knew immediately. The guy said, we knew in 10 seconds how we were going to make the vaccine. Okay, that's a gift from God. I mean, we have that kind of scientific ability, and that we have we have individuals so devoted to our public health that they were prepared when the time came. That's a gift from God.
Well, and the fact that every time that the quote unquote true scientists have tried to disprove biblical stories, they find more to support the biblical story than they do
To disprove it.
to
Yeah.
disprove it.
In a story like this, it's allegorical. It's teaching us a lesson about God. And there's plenty of other stuff where you can, where for centuries, science poo-pooed what was in the Bible, and then you find out archaeology proves it. So it goes both ways. But creation science and flood geology are pseudoscience. I'm on record saying that. So, okay, that's the science. Now, what about the attraction of this thing? It's not just, little kids making pictures of arcs or something, but it's also fascinating. It draws people to itself even today. I'll give you an example. If you go to Hong Kong, you can go to the Noah's Ark amusement park. Never mind that everything on the earth died. You're going there to have fun. If you go to Dordrecht, the Netherlands, you can find Johan's Ark, a Noah Ark themed barge that's literally floating. I read recently that the city council or the Marine Board said, you've got to prove that that thing will float, move it away and bring it back. You can't just leave it tied there sitting on the bottom. You got to prove that it really does. It really is a vessel. I don't know what they did with it. But if you really want to see it, you can go to Kentucky. Go to Ark Encounter in Kentucky. They've got one. They're 510 feet long with a full display inside telling you all about how God did this and how this was real, and proving you that there's answers in Genesis, promoting creationism and flood geology. Okay, that's a tourist attraction. That's not biblical. Yeah, Laura.
I saw a promotional film on that
Yeah.
in which they talk about the fact that they used original methods.
Oh, that is Laura.
And then later in the film, I noticed a huge bolt.
A huge metal bolt. Yeah. Well, everybody has their limitations. To me, this is an amusement center. It's not. That's not what the Bible's about. The Bible's about faithfulness to God, obedience to God, trusting in God, and believing His covenant. So that's where I come out with Noah's Ark. Yeah, it's a story that we like to play with our kids, but I keep coming back to just how serious this story was, how angry God was at the world. And I'm going to have a long conversation with the Almighty when I get there, I'll tell you. So that's kind of the last thing I'm going to do from our prehistory. Now, starting next week, we're going to move into literal history. Real people, real time. And so continue reading in Genesis, from 10 to about 20, I think it is. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the patriarchs, and the covenant. God starts making specific promises to a people, and they in turn make promises back to God. I shall be your God, you shall be my people. I'll tell you more about it next week, the specific terms for it and such. But we're leaving behind the allegorical story. Now we're moving into the literal present story of the growth, the development of the nation of Israel, the people of God. All right. So we're going to continue next week with Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, the characters of the Bible. I'm Dr. Jim Berger, the interim pastor here at Chapel by the Sea. Thank you for joining me. And any questions you might have or comments on today's lesson?
Just wonder what happened to the fish.
What happened to the fish?
Said he killed everything on earth. With
Yeah.
a flood, the fish would thrive.
Yeah. And where'd the water go? It's always fascinated me. That's a lot of evaporation.
Well, one of the things I heard too was that when all the rain comes down, it also opens the earth, the water came from.
there's a theory that the whole Earth split wide open and all the water came up through the crust of the Earth like a giant zipper all the way around. Oh, really? There's no evidence to support that. No real evidence, scientific or geological evidence, that such a fissure took place in the Earth and that there was such a reservoir underneath the Earth.
And if you've been over there and look at that, how arid everything is, it would take a year for that much water to soak into the ground. When it's so dry, it just
hard
runs
to
across the top.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, there's no water out there.
right, right. But that doesn't mean there wasn't water there 10,000 years ago. I mean, 23,000 years ago, those footprints in New Mexico, in the desert, they were made in mud
Right.
when they were made. So our world keeps changing. Climate change is nothing new. It's just that we've accelerated it. We just ramped it up. Put it on steroids. All right, friends, thank you for joining me. This concludes today's lesson, and I'll see you back here next week. And I'll be sure to tune in for us. Oh, let me give you an announcement, heads up. October 23rd, we're going to do a congregational conversation after worship. We'll have our light lunch here in Silver Hall, and then we're going to sit down and talk about who we are in chapel, where we've been, what's been the greatest times in our history, discuss some things like that. If you can't make it on the 23rd, we're going to repeat it on the 31st, but we're going to do it 23rd, 31st. Must be the 24th and the 31st. We'll do it again on Zoom. So you'll be able to come in live just like we are here. And if you're watching, you can get in on the conversation remotely. And then, of course, we'll be recording it, so it'll be available afterwards. So plan on that for me. The last 2 Sundays in October, our conversations about our future. Thank you, friends. God bless you, and may the peace of God abide with you and keep you as you move through this day. Amen.
Wonder where he is.
How's your daughter doing? How's your daughter doing? Your daughter.